from the her bedroom where they found her body, and nothing's on fire. I mean, the curtains next to her bed aren't on fire. The books next to her bed aren't burned. The furniture in the room is not burned. The rug is not burned. The only thing that was on fire in her room was the mattress, and nobody on the scene even reported seeing a flame. Now, I promise you, a mattress fire is way below temperature because that's why there's no flames. There's not enough oxygen in there and stuff. And if there had been anything in her apartment powerful enough to burn off her arm, it would have burned other things, because you're talking about 5,000 degrees there to vaporize a bone. All right. I mean, what happens is at that point with electricity, high voltage electrocutions do this, right? They explode the water in the bones. And I've got photos on my website, by the way, which is drmarysmonkey.com, but you spell it Dr. D-O-C-T-O-R. I got photos on there from other electrocutions showing very similar damage, where people's arms were blown off when they were trying to steal copper wire from an electrical distribution facility. But we also have Mary's photos there. If anybody wants to see these pictures I'm talking about, just go to drmarysmonkey.com, spell out doctor. And right there on the page you land on, at the top of the page, it says, "See why we call this the hottest cold case in America." Click on that, and you will see the crime scene photos. It took me years to locate.
Okay, great. So you've actually done some comparison investigation, compared it to electrocutions, and that's your conclusion, that it was by electrocution at another location. Then her body was moved back, and they set fire to the mattress. And was her body found on the mattress?
Well, when the mattress was smoldering, the room was full of smoke.
Okay.
And a neighbor called the police, not the fire department. Police couldn't even get in the apartment because there was so much smoke. When the firemen showed up, they went in and pulled out the smoking mattress. At that point in time, the smoke cleared enough for the police to go back in, and they found the body laying on the floor. I think it just rolled off the mattress when the firemen removed the mattress. Okay. But the body was what you call upside down. The feet were up by the headboard. And it was, despite being rolled off the mattress and everything else, if this had been recently dead, her limbs would have been flopping all over the place. But her left arm was stiff and stretched out. Her legs were stiff and stretched out, all like she had been dead for several hours and rigor mortis had started to set in. And so what you've got is you've got this crime scene that doesn't match the crime. I mean, the toaster didn't burn off her arm, nothing. This is a wood frame building. Right. And it is so acoustically transparent that the neighbors downstairs, when the police interviewed him, said, "Oh, we used to hear Dr. Sherman walking around all the time upstairs in her slippers." I mean, they could hear her slippers in their apartment down below, and they didn't hear anything that night. So there obviously was not an act of violence in her room, because the neighbors would have heard it.
Right. But wouldn't they have heard a couple of guys bringing this body in and dropping it down? Wouldn't they have heard that as well?
Well, if the people doing it knew that they were doing something that was highly illegal and they were making a great effort to be quiet, they could have done it quietly.
Especially if they were spooks or cops or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, people who, or athletes, I mean, people who were capable of carrying the body up the stairs. And there were apparently several people involved, because they found a blood-soaked pair of women's white cotton gloves in the laundry hamper, and the small woman with the white gloves probably did not carry the body up. She probably carried the keys up and unlocked the door while somebody else carried the body up. I mean, there's evidence of several things going on here. And again, what I can tell you about this story, this is like no other murder story you will ever hear, because the further you get into it, it keeps opening up. It's like Walt Whitman used to say about the blade of grass. If you understand this blade of grass, you'll understand the universe. If you understand this one murder and you start saying, who are these people? Where did they come from? I mean, let's take this woman, Dr. Mary Sherman. Who is she? Well, technically, she's an orthopedic surgeon, which is how my father knows her. But and my father was no slouch. He was out of Harvard Medical School. But she was out of the University of Chicago. What's going on at the University of Chicago? Well, for starters, that's where they're developing nuclear energy. That's where Enrico Fermi is, the first sustained nuclear reaction. That's where Harold Urey, who runs the Manhattan Project before they call it the Manhattan Project, winds up after the war. All these guys who are the heaviest hitters in radiation are at the University of Chicago. And Mary Sherman, besides being an orthopedic surgeon, is an expert in cancer and an expert in radiation, and she is widely published in the peer-reviewed journals, and she is quoted for the next 50 years in there. So Mary Sherman is a world-class heavy hitter involved in cancer and radiation, and she knows people like Enrico Fermi. And I know this because, Mary used to sit around and talk to my father. He'd smoke cigarettes and drink scotch together. My father would come home and tell my mother, and my mother would tell me, So I got the backstory on the fact that Mary Sherman was not a local doctor. And the people who read she was a local doctor, but she was way more than that. And the JFK researchers kind of stuff who read the Garrison interview figured she must have been some local yokel because she was involved with David Ferrie. But Mary Sherman was the chair of the pathology committee of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, which makes her one of the highest ranked women in American medicine. And David Ferrie was a defrocked priest with no medical credentials. Now, what are these two doing working in a secret laboratory on cancer together? And that was the question that drove me. And when you start to say, let's talk about who Mary Sherman works for. Well, she works for Alton Ochsner, founder of the Ochsner Clinic. He was president of the American Cancer Society. He's also the guy that arranged for the radio debates that exposed Lee Harvey Oswald as a communist in New Orleans in August of 1963. Now you got the president of the American Cancer Society, Lee Harvey Oswald, Mary Sherman, who's an expert in cancer and radiation, and she's got her right arm burned off, and I happen to know that somewhere in uptown New Orleans, there's a linear particle accelerator that's being operated in secret. And I wind up through a bunch of connected dots, but with a doctor who used to work at a big cancer clinic on the East Coast, and he was actually roommates with a guy that installed the linear particle accelerator at their facility. And we get talking about this, and he is able to give me enough information so that I'm starting to track down where the particle accelerator was. And we finally locate where it was. There was a linear particle accelerator. It was on, this is all secret stuff. This is like medical Manhattan Project. I'll tell you why it is secret in a minute. But it was located on federal property at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, which was operated by the U.S. Marines. It was guarded by the U.S. Marines, had a big wall around it, and had about 13 buildings on the campus. And one of the buildings in the back had all this weird wiring that was like you could have run a city out of that one building on all the electrical wiring. So when you start to piece all that stuff together, and you say, why all this secrecy? What are they doing with the linear particle accelerator? And why are they hiding it? Okay. Well, this guy, Alton Ochsner, was involved in the polio vaccine. And when you go back to the polio vaccine and you start to study the history on this, and this is why I said this story just keeps rolling around. The polio vaccine was grown on monkey kidney cells. And in the 1950s, they produced 200 million batches of the polio vaccine, first the Salk vaccine and then later the Sabin vaccine. And it was after they had released 100 million doses of the polio vaccine starting in April of 55. Two researchers up at the National Cancer Institute called Bernice Eddy, MD, PhD, and Sarah Stewart, MD, PhD, discovered a cancer-causing virus, which they named polyoma. And they're actually in Time magazine in 1957, I think it is, talking about this. And they say at the time, we've discovered that cancer is caused by a virus, and therefore we think it's possible to make a cancer-causing vaccine. Okay, now they're saying this back in the 50s, which I found really strange because I remember in the 60s, the word we got was cancer could not be caused by a virus. It was, some kind of weird genetic thing, and you couldn't transfer it or create it or anything else. But that was just a cover story, okay?
Well, wait, let me stop here for a second. Now, if you're saying that cancer can be caused by a virus, does that mean if someone had cancer that I could catch it from them? Is that how a virus works?
No, not necessarily. I mean, that's how the flu virus works. Okay. But some things are sexually transmitted. But what's happening here is you've heard about the HPV vaccine, the human papillomavirus vaccine, which causes cervical cancer in women and prostate cancer in men?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Well, the farmers today are out marketing a vaccine to stop the human papillomavirus from causing cancer.
Gotcha.
But you can't have a vaccine to stop a virus from causing cancer unless you have a cancer-causing virus, So they can no longer say that viruses don't cause cancer. And this particular, and I explain this in great detail in the book, this particular virus, which we'll get to talking about in more detail in a minute, is the most carcinogenic entity that medicine has ever discovered. And the problem is this virus is native to the Asian rhesus monkey, which is the monkey that's used most in blood research. And they grew the polio virus to make the polio vaccine on the kidney cells of these rhesus monkeys. And when they took out the virus for the vaccine, they got all the other viruses that were in the monkey kidney cells. And it was not until they had already released 100 million doses of this that these two researchers up at NIH/NCI tracked down this virus and realized it was in the polio vaccine. So they have just mass inoculated the entire American population with a cancer-causing monkey virus, and they still have another 100 million doses on the shelf. And I'm saying to you very clearly and to your audience that the polio vaccines from 1955 to 1963 were contaminated with a cancer-causing monkey viruses. And once I realized that, I went to the medical libraries and I got the statistics from NCI on cancer, and I saw that after the polio vaccine, a massive epidemic of cancer erupts in the United States, and we still have it today. I mean, we went from, 10 out of 100,000 people to 1 out of 3 going to get cancer during their lifetime. And so we are experiencing a cancer epidemic of massive proportions today. And I think the data very clearly shows that it happens right after the polio vaccine is distributed.
Now, do you think that happened by accident?
I prefer to say that it did. I think there were hasty public health decisions being made. They should have gone much slower. They should have been much more careful, but there was a reason that they weren't. And, you have to ask the next logical question. I mean, these questions are so simple and so obvious. It's amazing nobody's ever asked them and talked about them. The question is, why did we have a polio epidemic in the first place? And when did it start?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody remembers the hysteria about polio as being a 1950s phenomenon, where in fact you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, there were always 3,000 or 4,000 cases of polio around. That's a very small number of cases in medicine, okay? And you get to 1942, there's 4,000 cases. 1940,